run into that trouble? You're someplace and you lick your finger and you can't do it because there's a mask on. I made a mistake in last week's sermon, and I need to clarify. I said that all of the descendants of Levi served as priests in the temple, and that's not true. The descendants of Levi helped with the temple. You remember the passages in the New Testament that talked about the temple guards. The Levites served as temple guards, and they did other various things around the temple. Only the descendants of Aaron served as priests. So I just wanted to clarify that last week. I knew that, but I misspoke during the sermon last week. We're going to start this morning at the end of Hebrews. And for those of you who don't particularly like the book of Hebrews, you might be thinking, oh good, we're finally coming to the end of the sermon series. But that's not true. There's just something at the end of the book that we need to see. So we're in chapter 13, beginning in verse 22. And so our author writes, "Brothers, I urge you to bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written you only a short letter. I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released. If he arrives soon, I will come with him to see you. Greet all your leaders and all God's people. Those from Italy send you their greetings. Grace be with you all." So this book, the book of Hebrews, is a letter, like we see other letters in the New Testament. And like most of the letters that we have there, there's an ending. We read the ending here. What we don't have is the beginning. Somewhere along the line, the beginning of this letter, the greeting, where it says, "I so-and-so," the person writing the letter, and who they're writing the letter to, and usually the thanksgiving that appears at the beginning of all of Paul's letters, that got lost someplace. We have no ancient copies of the book of Hebrews that still have the greeting on it. God didn't save it for us, and so we don't know who wrote this letter, and we don't know who the letter was written to. We don't know who wrote it or who wrote it to. Some people have suggested that the Apostle Paul wrote it. He wrote many of the letters in the New Testament, and we see the theology of Christianity explained there, especially in the book of Romans. He goes into great detail explaining the justification and such. And so since this goes into a lot of detail about our salvation, some have thought that Paul must have written this, especially since it mentions Timothy here at the end. But if you read Paul's letters, there are certain phrases that he uses over and over and over again. For instance, he talks about us being in Christ. And you don't see those phrases anywhere in the book of Hebrews. So probably Paul didn't write the book of Hebrews. And others have suggested that maybe Luke, the doctor who wrote the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts, that maybe he wrote the book of Hebrews. But they're the same kind of thing. He writes in a very different style than some of the other writers of the New Testament, and Hebrews is not written in that same style, so probably Luke didn't write it as well. And almost anybody else mentioned in the New Testament has been suggested at one time or another as being the author of the book of Hebrews. But the truth is, we just don't know. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who they wrote it to. What we do know is we think we have a pretty good idea of why it was written. Hebrews was written to encourage continuing faith in Jesus, not new faith in Jesus. He's writing to those who are already Christians, and he's encouraging to them to keep holding on to Jesus. This congregation that he wrote to at one time in their history, probably in those early days in their history, experienced persecution. he writes of this in chapter 10. So let's look briefly there at chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. He says, remember those earlier days after you had received the light, in other words, after you received the gospel, after you were saved, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated, with others who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison. I assume he means Christians who were in prison, and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. That's quite a statement. You joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. Don't know whether it was just money or possessions or even houses, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. Better and lasting possessions. The blessings that we have in Jesus, the promises that God has made to us, the things that Peter writes are kept in heaven and can never fade or spoil or rust or fade or be stolen. The things that have no expiration date. So they experienced a time of persecution, and then following that kind of died off, and then they evidently had a period of peace, of not having persecution, and now they're living again in another time of persecution, another time of opposition by probably the Jews, the Jewish leaders, against their faith. And so he's writing to them to encourage them to hold on to Jesus. And if there are any clues in the letter itself as to the nature of the persecution they're facing, the clue would be that he goes into such great detail about Jesus as our high priest, replacing the previous priesthood, and Jesus as our great sacrifice, replacing all the other sacrifices that those other priests brought, that is supposed that part of this persecution is a threat that if they keep holding on to Jesus, they're not going to be allowed in the temple any longer. Well, you have to realize, again, that these Jewish Christians, because we believe they are Jewish Christians, or those Gentiles who had converted to Judaism before they became Christians, you have to remember how essential the temple was to their righteousness. Because you related to God through the Mosaic law, and a good part of that law was the sacrifices you had to bring to the temple when you sinned. You had to bring guilt sacrifices to the temple. And they'd been living under this system, not that generation, but the Jewish people had been living under this system for 1,500 years. 1,500 years. We think about our own nation. We're only, 200 and some odd years old. They've been living under the Mosaic law for 1,500 years. And they've been raised in this. They've been living this. And to think that there had to be days that they woke up and they said, is all this Jesus stuff really true? I mean, it's so fresh, it's so young, it's so radical. And now we're being threatened with not being able to go to the temple any longer, we think. That some of them had turned away from Jesus to go back to Judaism, and others were thinking about it. That's what we believe the letter is about. They're going to give up the righteousness that they believe they had with Jesus and go back to seeking righteousness through the law. Well, let's review the facts that we have so far that we've covered in the first couple of chapters in Hebrews. We've seen that he has presented evidence that Jesus is superior to the prophets, and Jesus is superior to angels. He's shown evidence that Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord, Jesus accomplished our salvation, Jesus is superior to Moses. Those are the facts that he's presented so far, and he's drawn 4 three responses from them based on those facts that he's presented. Number one, pay more careful attention to the gospel. Don't just take the gospel for granted. Don't stop thinking about the gospel. Every day when you get up, remember the gospel. He says to call on Jesus for help dealing with temptation. And in the beginning of chapter 3 we saw last week, he said, fix your thoughts on Jesus. Or to put it another way, consider who Jesus is, what Jesus did, and continue to trust in him for your righteous relationship to God. And so in today's passage, we're going to see him continuing to give them encouragement, further encouragement to continue their faith in Jesus. In fact, that's what he'll do the rest of the book, the rest of this, as he calls it, short letter, brief letter. Longer letter than I ever wrote in my life, I'll tell you that. And so he reminds them in today's passage, he reminds them of an event from the past, from Israel's past. He quotes from Psalm 95, part of Psalm 95. So we pick up in Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 7. So, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, meaning God's voice or the Spirit's voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw what I did. That's why I was angry with that generation. This is God speaking. That's why I was angry with that generation. And I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. So he's making a point here, and he makes his point just by quoting part of Psalm 95. And then he goes on. He doesn't explain the point that he's making from Psalm 95. He just expects his readers to understand. He expects them to recognize, oh, he's quoting from Psalm 95. And I know what Psalm 95 is about. And so he doesn't have to explain it to those Jewish readers. He just goes on. But we're not that familiar with Psalm 95. We don't recognize in some Bibles, like in the NIV I have here, it's written in a poetic form. So whenever you see those poetic form, you know that he's quoting from the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean I recognize where he's coming from or what that passage in Psalm 95 is about. And so for us, we need to go back to those passages and look. We need to figure out what he is trying to say. So we'll have to go back to Psalm 95, which we'll do in a moment. The first part of this psalm was today's scripture reading. I don't know if you picked up on that. As I mentioned that just now, the Psalm 95 has two portions, and the first part is saying, come, let us worship Yahweh, our God, because he's great and he's the creator and he's the high God and he deserves to be worshiped. He deserves to be paid attention to. He must be recognized. He must be obeyed. He must not be resisted. We must not resist God. And then the second part of Psalm 95, which our author didn't quote, the second part of Psalm 95 is all about not resisting Yahweh, not resisting God. So we pick up there in Psalm 95 at the end of verse 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah. Now, when we read it in Hebrews, it didn't say Meribah, did it? As you did at Meribah, and as you did that day at Massah in the desert. And it didn't say Massah in Hebrews as well. And I'll explain why in a moment. Where your fathers tested and tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, there are people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, this is God talking, they shall never enter my rest. They shall never enter my rest. So we had to find out about this Meribah and this Massa. He's talking about something that happened further back in the history of Israel. And so we have to turn to Exodus, and then turn to Exodus chapter 17. We need to know what happened back then. Now, let me set up the context of Exodus 17 for you. At this point in the history of Israel, they are about 2 months or so out of Egypt. Remember, they were slaves in Egypt. They lived in Egypt for 400 years. We don't know how long they were slaves in Egypt, probably at least 100 years, I would think. They've been there a long time, and finally God says, it's time to rescue my people from Egypt. And God appears to Moses and says, go back to Egypt and lead the people out of Egypt, out of their slavery. I hear them complaining and griping and praying in suffering. And Moses says, well, Pharaoh's not going to let us go. And God says, I'm going to do some miracles. And we read in those miracles over these last 2 months, Exodus 17, over these last 2 months, God had hit Egypt with a series of plagues. He turned the Nile River into blood for a time. Of course, and all the fish in the river died. He sent swarms of gnats and flies and locusts and frogs upon the land. He sent hail like they had never seen hail before, destroying most of the plants. He sent boils on people. If you don't know what a boil is, it's like a giant pimple that's really painful. Those red ones, not the white heads and not the black heads, just those other painful things. And several other plagues, including the death of the firstborn in every family. So finally, the Egyptians have enough of the Israelites, and they say, go, leave, and they leave. And God leads them then by a pillar of cloud or smoke in the daytime that turns to fire at night. Don't know how tall this thing was. Could have been 30, 40, 50 feet. Could have been 100 feet into the sky that just moves on its own, not coming from a campfire or something like that. Just moves there. They see this miraculous thing that no one has ever seen before. It eventually leads them to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts, and the ground is all dried up, and they go through in the middle of the night through the Red Sea and on dry ground. And then the Egyptian army comes in after them, and God brings the waters back down and drowns the Egyptian army. And after about 3 days in the desert, God starts providing them with this miracle food called manna that they eat. All of this they have experienced at the hands of God. The mighty power, the extraordinary power, the supernatural power of God to provide for them and to protect them. That's what's been going on for the last 2 months. As we come to Exodus chapter 17, and we begin in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as Yahweh, the Lord, commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put Yahweh, the Lord, to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. And the Lord answered Moses, walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massa and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? The Lord among us or not? So Meribah means quarreling. and Massa means testing. And that's what it's talking about there in Psalm 95. It's talking about this event there in Exodus 17, where they put the Lord to the test, where instead of showing faith in this one who has done all these miracles for the last 2 months, they still don't trust him. Many of them still don't believe in him. I think many of them believed in Moses. Moses has power, and Moses does these miracles. Moses is feeding us manna. So when we gripe and complain about having no water, we complain to Moses as if he could bring us water. Some of them believed in Moses, didn't believe in Yahweh at all. And even the ones who believed in Moses didn't really trust Moses. They weren't thankful that they had all these things. They weren't thankful that they were freed from slavery. So despite all the evidence of God being powerfully with them and for them, they hardened their hearts against him. They hardened their hearts against him. Now, some years before Jesus was born, the Jews realized that most Jews didn't speak Hebrew any longer. It was a dying out language. The trade language had become, the word escaped me. Aramaic. The trade language under the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians had been Aramaic, and gradually everybody started speaking Aramaic. When Alexander the Great took over from the Persians, the new trade language started to be Greek. And eventually it became Latin when the Romans took over. But in the days of Jesus, the trade language was Greek. But most of the Hebrews, people now, were speaking Aramaic. That was their native tongue. And they were no longer speaking Hebrew. They didn't know Hebrew, most of them. And so the Jewish leaders got together and said, we need to translate our scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, into Greek, the next trade language. And so that's what they did. And they got together 70 scholars or 72 church scholars, and they translated those scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. And because there were 70 scholars, we refer to it as the Septuagint translation. Septuagint is 70, refers to the 70. So the Christians in the New Testament age, when they're referring back to the Old Testament scriptures, they're referring back to this Greek translation of the Old Testament. And when the translators had come to these Hebrew words in Psalm 95, Massa and Meribah, instead of keeping them with the Jewish name, they used actually translated it because it was simply meant testing and quarreling. They translated it. And so that's why in Hebrews, when it's quoted in Hebrews, the word Meribah and Massa don't appear, because in the Greek translation, it didn't appear. Is that clear? Somewhat? Okay. But in this story, they had quarreled with Moses. They had grumbled and griped and complained about being thirsty and not having water to drink. And if they had simply asked for water, if they had come and Moses, we're thirsty, can we have some water? Is there any way we can get water? Would God give us some water? That would have been a very different attitude, probably an acceptable attitude, but they didn't come that way. They didn't come with faith in God, with thankfulness to God, gratitude to God at all. They came testing God, saying, is Yahweh among us or not? Is God among us or not? So their attitude was one of a hard heart towards God. And that's the issue that we're looking at briefly this morning. What does it mean to harden your heart? What does it mean to harden your heart? Because as we apply the book of Hebrews to us, even though we weren't the ones that complained and grumbled back there in the desert. And we weren't the ones when Psalm 95 was written. We weren't there as well. As believers in Jesus, there are times, aren't there, if you're honest, that you wake up and you think, I'm tired of being a Christian. I'm tired of doing all the stuff that I'm supposed to do as a Christian. Maybe there's another choice out there. I hope you don't say that. as they said as they say in the old Ghostbusters movies, who are you going to call? Who else are you going to call? There is no other answer. There is no other choice. But there have been days that you have doubts about the truth of the gospel. What does it mean to harden your heart? It means to resist faith in or obedience to Yahweh. Are you really there? God, Father, Jesus, Holy Spirit. Any hesitation, any lack of faith, any disobedience begins a hardening of your heart. A hardening of your heart. A resistance to God. Do not harden your heart. That's what our author is saying to these people. He's saying in this letter, do not harden your heart against God. Do not harden your heart against Jesus. Do not harden your heart against the whispers of the Holy Spirit. Do not harden your heart against the gospel. Do not harden your heart against God's word as the revelation of himself to us. If you say, I'll do it later, God, that's procrastination. You're hardening your heart. If you say, I don't want to take this New Testament command literally, God, you're reducing his command. You're hardening your heart. If you gripe and complain, I don't see why I have to do it, you're hardening your heart. If you say, I'm already as much like Jesus as I want to be, you're hardening your heart to his will for you. If you gripe and complain about his meeting of your needs, of his provisions, you're hardening your heart against him. If you, in the face of this continuing pandemic, if you're giving up your hope for the future, you're hardening your heart. If you've neglected the gospel, you're hardening your heart. If you've neglected Jesus in your prayers, you're hardening your heart. If you're refusing to deal with sins that the Holy Spirit is convicting you of, you're hardening your heart. And in the face of what you have experienced, of the supernatural power of God, of God's work in our world, in those positive answers to your prayers, in those miraculous circumstances that you think that's not just a coincidence, that's the hand of God. In the experiences that you have had of God, to turn your back on that, you are hardening your heart. And so today you need to soften your heart. You need to remember his promises, remember your blessings, and give thanks for them, and continue your faith in Jesus, no matter what you are facing today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. No matter what your problems are, no matter what your concerns are, no matter what the pandemic does or doesn't do, or the politicians do or don't do, or what happens in the world, continue your faith in Jesus. Because that's the answer that God sent to our greatest need. And there is no